in total when I was researching my PhD, very close to Spion Kop actually. I lived in Ladysmith, or just outside Ladysmith, and one of the things about the Boer War is, I can tell you from my experiences, very few people know much about it, and very few people care to learn much about it either. It's not a popular subject outside South Africa, or possibly parts of Australia if you're dealing with Breaker Morant. And so that specifically, could I speak about the Battle of Spion Kop, fought on the 24th of January 1900, which is the subject of my talk. In the pre-First World War period, Spion Kop was a byword for a bloodbath. It was the single bloodiest day of Queen Victoria's reign. The bloodiest battle that the British Army fought in this period by some margin. Bloodier than Isandlwana or Maiwand, bloodier than the fall of Khartoum, bloodier even than battles such as Inkerman and Sevastopol, depending on how one calculates the casualties. And what's quite shocking about the Battle of Spion Kop is it takes place in an incredibly condensed area, hence it being described after the battle as an acre of massacre. At the time, Spion Kop was seen almost as the epitome of British military command incompetence. And as we'll see, serious command mistakes were made. But it's also a tale of heroism, especially at the lower levels, at the front line, at the cutting edge. And it is a tale of skilled command, whether that's the British commanders on Spion Kop itself, or the Boer commander, Louis Botha, whose swift handling of the situation would ultimately lead to victory. But what's particularly fascinating and tragic about Spion Kop is how incredibly close the British came to winning a decisive victory. This is a battle which really turns on one man's key decisions very late in the day. It is a tragic story because all tragic stories have that moment when the battle may have turned. And had this battle been won, it could well have saved thousands of more lives because the British would continue to batter their way against the defences until eventually they broke them just over a month later at the Battle of the Tegela Heights at the end of February. And so the story today concerns a single day, but it's a very important day in the context of the Boer War. And just to remind us, because I don't think the Boer War is instantly familiar to us nowadays, about what the stakes were and what was being fought for in South Africa. Southern Africa, in the eve of the Boer War, the scramble for Africa had largely been completed. European powers had carved off various nations. Most of Africa was now under direct European administration. And within this scramble for Africa, South Africa actually represented an anomaly because, of course, South Africa was the only part of sub-Saharan Africa that had had significant long-term European settlement. Beginning in the 1650s in Cape Town, Dutch settlers had begun to settle here. What was originally a reprovisioning station for vessels traversing the Indian Ocean or returning to Europe gradually grew into a town, into a city, and gradually Dutch settlers spread out from Cape Town across what was known then simply as the Cape. Immigration to this area was never particularly large. It's an inhospitable climate, and at the eve of the Napoleonic Wars, perhaps 40,000 Dutch whites lived in the Cape Colony. And in the course of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain would annex the Cape, initially capturing Cape Town in 1806 to prevent it being used by French privateers. And then in the peace treaty that settled the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the British formally annexed this area known as Cape Colony. But this didn't just bring them a huge area of territory, it also brought them a very difficult and independently minded Dutch population, who even in the early 1800s referred to themselves not as Dutch, but as Afrikaners, literally Africans, or Boers, literally farmers. And the word Boer had no negative connotation, it simply described who they were. The British tried to encourage British immigration into Cape Colony. There were sponsored waves of immigration, mainly from Scotland, beginning in the 1820s, but the Dutch population nearly always outnumbered the British population. And the Dutch were now subject to British rules, laws and regulations, which they did not particularly like and they chafed against constantly. The turning point really came when Britain abolished slavery around the empire in the early 1830s. The Dutch had been a slaveholding society since they landed in South Africa. They were enraged at the idea of this. They were frustrated at the lack of compensation the government was offering them. And so somewhere in the region of 20,000 to 30,000 Boers would actually leave the British Cape and they'd go and they'd eventually, after a prolonged period, including a vicious war against the Zulus, would found their own republics, Transvaal and Orange Free State. The British would push their own boundaries up, including the new miniature state of Natal. Zululand, incidentally, sandwiched around about there, further north. And a state of sort of armed neutrality existed between the Transvaal Orange Free State and the wider British state. That culminated actually in a war, the First Boer War in 1880, that the Boers effectively won. They defeated a very small British force at the Battle of Majuba Hill in 1881. And the British government, not wanting to fund what promised to be a costly and prolonged war to conquer what were essentially two poverty-stricken agricultural Dutch states, decided to make a peace treaty to allow the Dutch to retain their territory. And that peace treaty may well have held had it not been for the discovery of the world's biggest gold and diamond deposits in initially Orange Free State and later in Transvaal in the mid-1880s, prompting a huge gold rush. And from that point onwards, really, there was a countdown to how long it would be before the British attempted to annex these extremely wealthy, small Dutch states. Various diplomatic problems developed, the British campaigning very hard to try and encourage the Boers to give their new immigrant population the vote. In the mistaken, as it turned out, British belief that the immigrants would vote overwhelmingly to be absorbed by the British Empire. There was an attempt to overthrow the Boer government with mercenaries, the so-called Jameson Raid in 1895 and 1896, which was a total disaster. And then by October 1899, British forces were actually massed in northern Natal, supposedly as a peacekeeping force to keep the Boers honest, but the Boers feared, probably correctly, that this was a precursor to a much larger force arriving and invading on some spurious pretext. And so rather than wait for that British invasion, the Boers actually decided to strike first, much as they'd done in 1880, declare war against the British, cross the border into British South Africa, defeat the British army in battle, and then negotiate a peace deal as a result, which is exactly what had happened in 1880 and 81. So in October, the Boers declared war and mustered their army. This is a great photograph, obviously being coloured by a modern artist, but it's a group of Boer fighters in October 1899, as they muster, in fact. This is taken just before they cross the border into British South Africa, and it captures something of the nature of the Boer army. It was a citizen army. There was almost no trained element within the army. The only formally trained part of the army was actually its artillery arm, the Staats artillery, which was trained in in German and French artillery schools, and was mainly equipped with French artillery. But the average Boer fighting man was like this, effectively men in civilian clothes who would bring their own rifle and their own horse. If you didn't possess those things, or if your rifle was out of date, you would be given a Mauser rifle by the Boer authorities. And although these men did not have formal military training, a large number, though not all, a large number were frontiersmen, were outdoorsmen, had tough lifestyles. And they had a very distinct gun culture as well. The rifle was a means and a metaphor in South Africa for male independence. Most boys would be given their first gun around about the age of 12, usually a very small caliber rifle, and would be given a formal gun when they were 14. Having skill with that firearm was a way you distinguished yourself as a man in Boer society. And it carried with it, of course, practical purposes. South Africa was a violent place in 1899, something akin to the Wild West. And most Boers would supplement their diets with hunting. It was plentiful game. You can't shoot, you can't hunt, you can't defend your homesteads either. So there was a strong gun culture, and there was a strong horse culture. Though South Africa had railroads, they were still being developed when the war broke out, and most Boers would actually get from one place to another on horseback, using the very distinctive South African ponies, sometimes called the Veld pony. These were descendants actually of the original horses the Dutch had brought here in the 1600s. And over the centuries, they'd actually changed, they'd become a little smaller, they'd become a little shaggier around the tail and around the nose, and crucially they could eat the grass of South Africa, which is very lush, and actually not very good for most horses from Europe. Small, almost ponies really by the time of the Boer War. But what this meant was Boer fighters were skilled riflemen, tough, hardy individuals who could survive on pretty meagre rations, and all of them were mounted as well, which meant they were fast moving, and they wouldn't fight mounted, at least not at this stage of the war, but they used their horses to get to a position, dismount and take up a firing line, engage the enemy, and then possibly mount up again to redeploy. So effectively they were an army of mounted infantry. And the Boers formed units that were known as commandos that were based on regional association. It's no surprise that Winston Churchill, when he founded Britain's first special forces in 1940, he chose the name commandos himself. He was a veteran of the Boer War, being captured by the Boers. And he remembered how tough the Boer commandos had been, especially in the guerrilla phase of the war. And he explicitly said that he wanted men of the commando class, the type of men who'd fought the British Empire to a standstill 40 years earlier to now fight the Germans. So the Boers were a pretty formidable force, although initially they were greatly underestimated, and the opening moves of the war, which we can summarise briefly, not the best map, but it does capture the direction of the Boer offensives. What the Boers wanted to do was not conquer South Africa, but instead defeat the British army within South Africa. To this end, they laid siege to the border town of Mafeking to stop any kind of British incursion into Bechuanaland. They laid siege to the railway junction town and mining centre at Kimberley, key element that would block any reinforcements from Cape Town. They pushed forces into what's known as the Cape Midland area to block the rail lines here. But the most important Boer offensive was into Natal in the direction of Ladysmith, itself a rail junction town north of the Segala River, and it was here where the main British army was stationed. And in a period of a blistering real period of just over 2 weeks, 3 weeks if we're being absolutely precise, the Boers inflicted a string of defeats upon the British army in Natal and drove it back into Ladysmith. A last attempt by the British to sortie out of Ladysmith at the end of the month was crushingly defeated at the Battle of Ladysmith, known at the time as Mournful Monday. A complete disaster in which everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and a number of British troops were driven back in a panic into Ladysmith. And what this meant was, by the end of October, the Boers were in a very strong position. They had actually trapped just about every mobile element of the British army in South Africa somewhere. Small garrison at Mafeking, a bigger one at Kimberley, and the main force in Ladysmith was now trapped and besieged. And apart from a small force of cavalry which cut its way free and escaped, some 12,500 British soldiers were now trapped at Ladysmith under Boer siege. And in Britain, it was by no means clear how long the British garrison could actually endure this siege. The rest of South Africa lay completely open and exposed. There was a great deal of fear the Boers would push on to the port of Durban and perhaps sack it or lay siege to that. And although some Boers thought about that, it was never a realistic proposition. But what the Boers wanted to do was force the garrison at Ladysmith to surrender. It would be the biggest surrender of British troops since the Napoleonic Wars, and it would deal such a massive blow, the Boers hoped, to British prestige that it would lead to this negotiated settlement that they desired. And so Ladysmith was encircled, laid siege to, and how long Ladysmith would hold out was not entirely clear. There was still a deep cultural memory in Britain of what had happened to Gordon at Khartoum in the 1880s, and although the Boers weren't going to massacre the British if they surrendered, nevertheless a major surrender of the British army here would be humiliating, and it would carry a real risk the Boers would win the war, not least because the European powers hostile to Britain were already looking for an opportunity to intervene diplomatically and force the British to the negotiating table. And the Kaiser himself even suggested to his old enemies, France and Russia, that they form a triple alliance with the express purpose of forcing the British to negotiate over this. The Russians and the French politely declined, but if the British army at Ladysmith collapsed and was marched into captivity, they might well have joined the Kaiser to humiliate their neutral enemy. But hope was on its way. Hope was arriving, because the British had dispatched at the very outbreak of the war what would become known as the Natal Field Force. A mixed British force, somewhere in the region of about 48,000 men, under the command of this man, Reevers, and assured by his surviving family called Reevers rather than Redvers, Reevers Buller Victoria Cross. Reevers Buller was a hero of the Empire. He'd won the Victoria Cross in the Zulu War for an act of tremendous bravery, saving his scout troopers from an onrushing Zulu force. And in his younger days, he'd been a physically huge and imposing man, a muscular man, very capable with his hands in a close quarters battle. He'd been seen as one of the great minds of the British Army, in fact, through the 1880s, and even into the early 1890s. And much was expected of him as he was sent out to take command of the Natal Field Force and lead it to victory. He'd already been earmarked to go out before the war began. Problem was, Buller was old now. It was 20 years since he'd won the VC, and by his own admission, his muscle had turned to fat. His energy that he was once known for was no longer quite so apparent, and he actually did much as he could to try and actually not have the job. I think he knew in his heart of hearts that he was not suitable for this, and he also knew something of the Boers. He had fought alongside the Boers in the Zulu War, and he knew how tough and resourceful they were, and he thought the British government greatly underestimated the dangers they were about to face. But seniority demanded that Buller be sent out. He arrived in South Africa to find a confused and difficult situation. His original plan had been to operate his force, the Natal Field Force, 48,000 strong, link up with the existing British Army in South Africa, and then march as a unified force against the Boers. That would have given him somewhere in the region of 60,000 men against a Boer military that never numbered more than about 35,000. But of course he arrived to find the situation was very different. The Boers had encircled Ladysmith, they were laying siege to Kimberley and Mafeking, and they were blocking the Cape Midland area too. And so Buller had to make a decision the moment he arrived to subdivide his force, sending relief forces to Kimberley, a force to clear the Cape Midlands, whilst he retained the main force, about 20,000 men, with the view of hammering his way towards Ladysmith. But his first attempt to do so at the Battle of Colenso on the 15th of December 1899 would end in disaster. Colenso was a warning, really, for Buller and the British that the Boers were not to be trifled with. A remarkably crude, brute force, blunt assault against a Boer position, which you can see in the hills in the background, which overlooked the Tugela River, miscarried from the moment it began. Two supporting artillery batteries, 14th and 66th, under a man known as Galloping Charlie, Charles Long, went forward far too close to the Boer lines to begin the assault and immediately came under brutal fire. Their teams were shot down, the batteries were isolated, 12 guns in total. Though they held out for as long as they could, eventually the gun crews were driven away from the guns and 12 guns were actually abandoned in the field. The Boers would end up capturing 10 of them, the worst loss of British artillery since the Napoleonic Wars. Elsewhere, an infantry assault across the river miscarried completely. They actually got lost during the advance on the river, crossed at the wrong point, and every British soldier who made it across the river was either killed or captured. And the entire battle was essentially a fiasco, with over 1,000 British casualties against a grand total of 3 Boers killed and perhaps 30 wounded. A very, very one-sided battle, which startled Buller, I think. His failure here and the casualties he sustained, especially the loss of the guns, stung him deeply. And in the aftermath, Buller, who, as we've established, didn't want to be here, actually gave out a scandalous signal to the garrison at Ladysmith, telling them to destroy their ammunition, surrender, and get the best terms they could. That is not a very encouraging message from your relief force commander. Fortunately, the garrison at Ladysmith was made of sterner stuff. They did not surrender. They held out, and they awaited another attempt for Buller to break through. Buller had to spend some time licking his wounds. I should add that his other relief forces were all also defeated in December in a period known as Black Week. And at that point, the British really had a decision. They'd lost a series of battles, significant battles. The Boers thought they'd won the war, that it was Majuba all over again. A battlefield victory would lead to their political freedoms. But this time it was different. Embarrassed in South Africa, worried about European intervention, and worried about what the wider empire would think, rather than making a negotiated peace, this time the British government doubled its efforts. Thousands of reinforcements would flood into South Africa, including men from the colonies, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. A new overall commander would be sent out, the venerable Lord Roberts, VC, aged 69 when he was appointed, and still mourning the death of his only son, Freddie, who was killed at the Battle of Colenso. And amongst the reinforcements came this man, Major General Charles Warren, who was shipped out directly to Buller with effectively a new division that went out. Though the division would be subdivided before it actually arrived and joined Buller. And Charles Warren is a fascinating figure. He was quite a famous man in 1899. He's famous for two things, neither of which pertain to his Royal Engineers military career. He was well known as an archaeologist who'd been involved in this incredible period of archaeological exploration in the Middle East and in Egypt. He was known, incidentally, for, and I quote, enjoying all the delights of the Ottoman Sultan while he was living out in the Middle East. I'll leave that to your imagination to fill in. But he was most famous for being the chief of the Metropolitan Police during the murder spree of Jack the Ripper, which he'd singularly failed, of course, to solve, for which he'd caught an enormous amount of opprobrium as a result. And that was probably what he was best known for, even in 1899, despite his archaeological achievements. He had some military experience, but only commanding relatively small forces in relatively small expeditions. But what he did have was the ear of the British government, and they decided that Warren was the man to go out and potentially take over from Buller, whose actions during the campaign had alarmed the British government considerably. Warren, I think the best way I can describe him is an odd man. He had odd habits, he did odd things, and one thing he was not was a subtle man. He arrived with a special secret letter from the British government, which announced that if Buller was incapacitated or relieved, Warren was going to take over. Now, a wiser man might have kept that letter tucked safely in his pocket. Warren was not that man. On his first meeting with Buller, he actually unfurled the letter and showed it to him and invited him to read it. And although this may have been an act of overt honesty, Buller did not receive this news terribly well. He perceived correctly that Warren was being sent out not as an understudy, but as a potential replacement. And the two men immediately disliked each other. Warren thought that Buller was stupid, lazy, and arrogant. Buller thought that Warren was an intellectual pedant who could not help himself, but, and I quote, help himself but point out the most minor defects in the speech of my fellow officers. They were not getting on very well, and Warren was a pedant, and Buller was, at times, certainly arrogant and lazy. So there was some truth in this, but it did not augur well for a renewed attempt to relieve a besieged British garrison. And from this very moment they meet in early January, the two men dislike each other, and I get the sense that Buller has got that sort of childish approach where a new man has come out who is obviously being groomed to be Buller's successor, and Buller's effectively said, well, go on then, you do better than me. And Buller effectively removes himself from command of this campaign and leaves it all to Warren with, okay, Warren, you work out how we're going to get through this. You do it. It's not a great setup for the campaign that's going to come. But despite this, Warren's actual initial idea is not inherently bad. Because when he arrives, he finds the British army is effectively stationed here at Cheveley, facing, that's the Boer line, is just north of the river there, Ladysmith off the map, of course. Colenso, where the battle was fought, the British have fallen back some distance. Rather than trying to attack through Colenso again, or possibly swinging around into the rugged terrain to the east, Warren suggests swinging west through an area that's now actually a man-made reservoir, with the idea of getting across the Tegela River over here and looking for breaking through a line of hills here. Now what this map doesn't quite show you is that there is a line of hills here. You can see the rugged terrain in green. But those rugged hills here are probably at their thinnest at this point. And once you clear those hills, there is a flat plain that runs all the way to Ladysmith. If the British could capture that line of high ground, the Boers effectively had no defensive position they could occupy in the plains beyond. They'd be overlooked by British artillery and they'd be pounded into oblivion. It is an absolutely pan-flat plain. And Warren's plan was to swing up there, get across the Tegela River before the Boers could fortify it, get onto the hilltops and break through to that plain beyond. And in that sense, it was a good plan. The problem was the execution of this plan was very poor. The British army, if it had been able to swing rapidly into this, might have done it. But it couldn't, and it couldn't for several reasons. The first reason was one of bad luck. Although it was the South African summer, January, anybody who's been in South Africa in the summer knows you get some ferocious thunderstorms. especially in this part of the world. Absolutely staggering ones. There's an Afrikaner phrase that translates roughly as rain so heavy that it kills the small frogs and makes the large ones wear hats. If you've ever been there and experienced it, you'll know what I mean. And I've been caught in one of those, and I honestly thought I was going to drown. It was so heavy. Just before the British began that manoeuvre, a series of those storms blew across from the Drakensberg Mountains and turned the very limited roads, which are really no more than farmers' tracks, into an absolute quagmire. What this meant was the storms blew past. As the army began to manoeuvre, rather than a rapid march, instead it was a lumbering procession. The army moved an average of 2 miles an hour, far too slow. The Boers actually saw them travelling gradually up here, gradually up here. The Boers decided not to defend the river line. As you can see from the ground here, it's actually quite flat on the other side of the river, not good defensive positions. Instead, the Boers occupied that high ground, ready to defend it. And the British lumbered in this general direction, got across here. There was a moment actually where the British might just have broken through with Lord Dundonald's cavalry on a wide flanking manoeuvre, actually got on top of the hills to the further west and found them undefended. And effectively could see the lights of Ladysmith in the distance. There was an opportunity there for perhaps daring. Dundonald, who had a fairly small force, probably only in the region of about 1,500 mounted men, really called for, send me everything you've got, we can break through. But Warren said no, and historians have been very critical about this, but in reality, there simply wasn't any prospect. Even if Dundonald had broken through there, I think the Boers would have just encircled him and gobbled him up. The British infantry would not have been able to catch up with it. What instead happened was a series of pretty bitter fighting along the lower slopes here. The Boers occupying the upper slopes, the British probing along here for several days, looking for a way through, without success. And this is a really good, this is actually a film still. This is not a photograph, this is a still from a silent film, because there was a camera crew out actually with Warren's detachment, and it filmed Warren's army. This is crossing the Tegela River. Spion Kop will be behind us here. Unfortunately, best efforts trying to incorporate the film into this just didn't work, but this is, I think, quite an evocative photo, because this is the 2nd Lancaster Fusiliers, and some of these men will be dead within the week. They will be on Spion Kop and meeting their end. But the army originally did get across to the north side of the Tegela River, and for several days, between the 20th and the 24th of January, it skirmished with the Boers, without a great deal of success. The terrain here was rugged, the Boers had the high ground, British attempts to advance up it were stymied by Boer rifle fire and by the brutal South African heat. This area doesn't have much shade, you're quite high above sea level. And after several days of probing attacks, Warren was looking for the key to unlock this Boer defensive position. And he thought he found it here. And this is Spion Kop we're north of the Tegela River here. This is roughly where the British field gun line was at the Battle of Spion Kop. That is Spion Kop itself, across there, that plateau. The range from, I took this photograph myself, isn't it wonderful, isn't it beautifully framed? I took this photo myself, and the British field gun line was somewhere in the region of about 3,000 to 2,500 yards from the summit of Spion Kop, so quite close, pushed up, but bear in mind these are relatively small field guns, 15-pounders. So that's roughly that distance there. And notice this sort of smaller hill area here, that's Three Tree Hill, which can lead up to Spion Kop. Spion Kop seemed, in this hill line, to dominate the surrounding hills. And if I give you a better shot from roughly where Warren's HQ was, this gives you some idea of what it would look like from the British ground. Now this is roughly where Warren's HQ was. It was actually a bit further in that direction, but I was on the roadside, so you take photos as you best can. If you look at this, and imagine you are Warren looking at that, it looks like Spion Kop dominates hills alongside it. So you have Little Knoll or Allow Knoll, Twin Peaks. Not pictured over here, you have another hill called Green Hill and Conical Hill. And then you have a mountain stretch effectively called Tabanyama, which is Black Mountain, because it looks black when the light reflects upon it. That's where the main Boer position was. Warren thought that Spion Kop could be the key to unlocking this entire defensive position. The Boers did have forces on these hills, But Warren believed that because Spion Kop seemed to overlook the wall, if he could position forces there and bring guns onto Spion Kop, British guns would dominate Boer defences in multiple directions. You could take these defences along here in Enfilade, and you could to an extent take the defences in that direction in Enfilade as well. And this seemed, if it could be seized, you couldn't really assault it in the middle of the day, it's a bit too tricky. If you could seize this under cover of darkness, establish a defensive position there, hold it against Boer counterattacks, and then bring up artillery to crest that ridge and dominate the defences, you could unlock the entire ridge position. And in that sense, it was quite a daring and ambitious plan. It was more innovative and daring than Buller's headfirst assault at Colenso, for example. And Warren was prepared to try it. There was a problem though, and this was the fact that, and ignore the red lines for now. The problem was Spion Kop didn't dominate this position in the way that Warren thought. As you've seen from the ground, it looks as though Spion Kop is higher than all the other hills. In reality, it's about level with Green Hill over there, and to a lesser extent Conical Hill. It's a little higher than Allo Knoll and Twin Peaks, but not much. And crucially, it's not exactly overlooked by Taverniana, but if you're on Taverniana and you look down to Spion Kop, you have a beautiful view of the summit. Boer artillery and riflemen there had an excellent view, whereas British guns down here could not engage Taverniana. They couldn't see it, they didn't really have the range to hit it, and the Boers had carefully positioned their own artillery groups in such a way that it was difficult for anybody to see them. And what this meant was that Spion Kop, it's sometimes described as a false crest, or as actually being lower than the crests around it. That's not strictly true, but crucially, all of the Boer positions had very good vision onto the top of Spion Kop, whereas the British down in the valley had very little vision onto the Boer defences. What this meant was any British force getting onto Spion Kop would be exposed to fire from multiple directions. Warren's plan to enfilade these positions was right, but what he hadn't considered was, if he could enfilade the Boers, they could potentially enfilade him too, and indeed they could, and as we'll see, they would. And Warren's belief was that the Spion Kop was so high it wouldn't be vulnerable to this, but in fact, that difference in elevation is actually pretty minor, and it's almost non-existent from Taverniana. The view from the Boer gun line towards Spion Kop from Taverniana is a gunner's dream. And for the British infantry assault, it was going to become a nightmare. But all this lay in the future. The first step was to launch a night assault, which would actually begin on the 23rd and culminate on the 24th of January. And one thing that perhaps I should have really emphasised is the size of Spion Kop. It's about 1,400 feet above sea level, so it's a fair, what we would call in Britain a mountain, effectively. Small mountain. And crucially too, it's not easy to get up there. In fact, if I go back a few slides, the approach to Spion Kop is effectively up this sort of escarpment. Can't go up it straight, it doesn't work. You have to sort of walk up this snake-like really. Way back in 2010, I and a few others, when I was younger and fitter and lighter, and wearing all the latest sort of Gore-Tex stuff, I actually ascended this with a group. And we, of course, we've got nice light backpacks, lovely walking boots, we're not carrying Lee Enfield rifles or wearing sun helmets. It took us the better part of 90 minutes, somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes, and it's tough. It's tough going, it's not an easy climb at all. It's a bit treacherous, in fact. There's some little followers path, some little goat and sheep path, but it's pretty treacherous going, and we did it in the day, and the sun is absolutely relentless, just beats on you, brutally so. So it is not an easy climb. To go from the base to the summit, nowadays, is going to take you between an hour and 90 minutes. In the context of 1899, it's going to take you a lot longer. And indeed, the night march, mixed force of British infantry and also some South African volunteers, set out from camp at 8:30. It took them until 11:30 to reach the base of Spion Kop, and it took them 4 hours to actually make it to the edge of the plateau for the assault to begin. So 4 hours to actually scale that. And of course, this is done in conditions of darkness, moving silently as much as possible. on a hot summer's night. The Boers actually had a small defensive position atop Spion Kop. In fact, some German engineers in Boer service had actually been on Spion Kop and had been preparing a gun position, but had abandoned it because they believed Spion Kop was too exposed and it was not a good defensive position. So there was some scratch Boer earthworks here, and there was a small Boer garrison. The Boer garrison actually heard the British as they approached the summit. Couldn't help but make noise, clattering in the darkness. And there was actually a nervous little burst of firing from the Boers, which was the signal for the British to assault. Charging forward, actually shouting, "Majuba, Majuba." And the very first Boer to be killed at this battle, who's actually commemorated on the summit, would be an unknown soldier. He was probably a Polish immigrant, part of a Boer commando, perhaps a man who didn't actually speak Dutch, who joined it. Nobody knew his name. He would be killed. And the picket, which was no more than about 20 men, was driven off the summit, with perhaps 6 casualties, having inflicted about 10 in return in a very brief but confused battle. The Boers retreated down into the plain, disappeared, and the British had captured the summit, which meant they could now implement the next part of Warren's plan, because Warren understood that Spion Kop would have to be held for a period of time before the artillery could be brought up. And he had given orders to the assault force to entrench itself atop Spion Kop. Exactly what happened next is still unclear. There's 3 possible suggestions. The first is that the British were confused by the existence of the Boer earthworks, that were these gun pits that were being dug, and thought that this immediately started digging around those, which didn't put them on the very edge of Spion Kop, but instead put them slap bang in the middle. Another theory is that the British didn't realise in the night, and it was a foggy night as well. Very, very common to have heavy fog in the summer in this part of South Africa. There was an extremely dense fog over Spion Kop that night. The British just started digging on what they thought was the summit, but left the edge of Spion Kop undefended. And the third explanation is the assault force was utterly exhausted. They'd been at it all night. They'd had a grueling 4-hour climb. They just dug wherever they landed. They weren't really interested in scouting this out. The trench that they dug was very shallow. Although a group of Royal Engineers with equipment had gone up with them, the Royal Engineers were totally exhausted and were basically unable to dig. And equally, those who did do some digging found that the ground underneath was very rocky and stony. After a layer of topsoil, you hit solid rock, so you couldn't dig more than what we would call a straight trench. And crucially, as you can see, although Spion Kop is higher than these positions, it's not higher by much. This is in feet, by the way. So Spion Kop's trench dug around about 1,470 feet. All of these other positions, although lower, often in many cases not lower by much, just 90 feet lower, for example, at Conical Hill, or 120 feet lower at Little Knoll, and they all had visibility onto this. And in the fog, the dense morning fog, the British were not aware what was exactly awaiting them. And neither too were the Boers, but what the Boers did have was a commander who was willing to take action, and this was the young Louis Botha, of course, a man who had a very significant career in South Africa. Botha was the commander of the Boer forces here, and he was very conscious that if the British broke through on this hill line, then consequences of a very severe nature were going to follow. He was determined to hold this line. And Botha, who of course had a different view of these positions, knew that Spion Kop was basically indefensible from his own perspective, and so he was not dismayed to learn the British had captured it. What he was dismayed about was this created some panic in the Boer camp. Some Boers were mounting up ready to ride away, and the Boers, who never really benefited from great military discipline, weren't exactly in a state of panic, but they were in a state of disorder. Botha himself rode into the camp and rallied his men, in some accounts rallying them with his whip, if necessary, whipping them back into their positions and telling them that unless they reclaimed Spion Kop, then the campaign would be lost, and with it their homes, which was quite a prophetic warning. And even with the mist still blanketing the hills, South African dawn in the summer, beginning really about 4:30 in the morning, Boers could not see what was happening on the hills, but they knew that they were there. The British were on Spion Kop, but they also knew their own defences remained on the other hills. Botha rallied the troops down in the plain, organised an assault force of several hundred Boers who were going to try and assault Spion Kop from the Boer side, where actually the climb up from the Boer side is much, much easier than the climb from the British side. He sent additional ammunition to his gun positions on the other hilltops, some additional fighters there, and he prepared to retake Spion Kop. For several hours, nothing very much happened. The Boers began to move up their side of the hill. Boer positions were strengthened, but everybody was waiting for the fog to clear. And this is an artist's impression, I see a German artist, of the struggle for the edge of Spion Kop. A lot of artistic liberties going on here, the Boers in a sort of semi-uniform and things. But what happened was, around somewhere between 6:30 and 7 a.m, firing began. Boers had reached the edge of Spion Kop, and they could see the British had entrenched themselves, depending on whereabouts you were on the edge of Spion Kop, somewhere between 20 to 100 yards from the edge. Firing began, and in fact the commander of the British force atop Spion Kop was killed in this initial exchange. Colonel Woodgate was mortally wounded, shot through the head. Very soon after, his second in command would be wounded, and then his third in command would be wounded too. But what was realised was, we're not entrenched on the edge of this position. We're actually entrenched in the middle of Spion Kop, and the Boers have come up the slope. They're going to be engaging us at very, very close range, no more than 100 yards. An order was given actually to secure the ridgeline, and a small British force burst out of the trenches, got to the edge of the ridgeline, and engaged the Boers. Initially drove them back. The mist was still dense at this stage, but by 7:30 a.m, the mist had fully cleared, and a really fierce battle began between the defenders on the edge of Spion Kop and the Boers assaulting their way up it. And as I must emphasise, the Boer side of the hill is much, much easier to ascend, and also has plentiful cover, a great number of rocks and boulders that the Boers could skirmish behind. A British veteran of this actually remembered the Boers coming up the slope, moving like, as he described it, an aggregate of lion hunters, bursting from one piece of cover to the next. Whenever one man moved, 5 of his comrades would fire to keep the British heads down. The British returned fire with volleys down the slope, but this was given away very quickly by the shouts and obviously the movement of the British soldiers. The Boers would throw themselves flat or duck behind rocks and then return fire on the British while they were stood in an exposed position. And over the next 30 minutes, the Boers skirmished their way to the top of the ridge, and in a rare example of in the Boer War, a genuine hand-to-hand melee broke out between the British defenders and the Boers. There's some vivid accounts here, including one of a strapping British soldier actually picking a Boer up with both hands and physically throwing him down the slope. There's equally accounts from the Boer side of them grabbing British soldiers, dragging them from behind cover and then silencing them with either a rifle butt or a hunting knife. Within the space of 30 very brutal minutes, the defenders of the ridgeline were overwhelmed. One of the reasons for that was the defenders in the trenches could not provide fire support. Defenders in the trench couldn't see what was happening at the crest. The Boers are coming up that slope, and the defenders in the trench line were under very, very heavy fire themselves. Because to go back to this, as the mist cleared and the assault went up there, defenders on Conical Hill, Little Knoll, Twin Peaks and Tabanyama further up there all began to pour fire onto the British trench. Artillery and rifle fire onto a completely exposed position that was obvious because it had created a sort of brown smear across the trench. Very, very easy to engage, and the trench itself provided very, very little cover to this incoming fire. What this meant was the two British forces could not support each other, the British trench being raked by fire from the front and from the flank. The defenders at the crest line were overwhelmed by about 8 a.m, maybe the last group going at about 8:30, and the Boers now lined the edge of Spion Kop and were engaging at very, very close range. Combined with all this fire coming from multiple directions, the British now found themselves in an incredibly difficult position, pinned down effectively, returning fire against the Boers as best they could, but under intense pressure. Pressure from a variety of directions, including this. This is a 37mm pom-pom gun, an autocannon, probably more famous as an anti-aircraft weapon in the First and Second World Wars. The Boers had at least one, possibly two pom-pom guns on Twin Peaks, which was on the flank, that could fire these brutal raking bursts. They'd fire a belt of ammunition, You can see the ammunition there that would of course fire with its distinctive pom 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 pom. And not only was this extremely disturbing, you could see the rounds ploughing their way along the trench, but it also provided an excellent aiming point for Boer heavier artillery that was positioned further to the north. Between 8:30 and 12:30, there was a really brutal firefight. The Boers pounding the British trench, the British returning fire as best they could. Boers along the crest line trying to edge forward. The Boers actually tried several assaults towards the trench, but each of them were actually repulsed because the moment the Boers broke cover from the edge of the crest to try and rush, the British would open fire and then brutally mow them down. And so this really vicious firefight went on. And I'd like to read you a quote actually from Dennis Reitz, an 18-year-old Boer commando, wrote a great book, Corps Commando, and had an incredible life that would actually see him commanding the Scots Battalion on the Western Front by 1918. But in 1899, he was in the thick of the firefight, and he remembered this. We were sustaining heavy casualties from the English scans, that means breastwork, immediately in front of us, and the men grew restive under the galling point-blank fire, a thing not to be wondered at, for the moral effect of Lee Metford volleys at 20 yards must be experienced to be appreciated. The English troops lay so near that one could have tossed a biscuit amongst them, and whilst the losses which they were causing us were only too evident, we on our side did not know that we were inflicting even greater damage upon them. Our own casualties lay hideously amongst us, but theirs were screened from view behind the breastwork. And the Boer fighters on the crest line were actually suffering quite heavy casualties. Anybody who stuck their head up above that crest line was engaged, and they were suffering, but the British in the trench were suffering even more. And although Ritz's account implies that things weren't going well for the Boers, for the British it was absolutely brutal. And a British account, a bit of dramatic artwork here, gives the British side of this battle. The shells were falling on the hill from both sides, as I counted, at the rate of about 7 a minute, and the strange discharges of the Maxim shell guns, the pom-poms as these terrible engines are called, for want of a correct name, lacerated the hillside with dotted chains of smoke and dust. The dead and injured, smashed and broken by the shells, littered the summit till it was a bloody, reeking shambles. Thirst tormented our soldiers, for though water was at hand, the fight was too close and furious to give even a moment's breathing space. So if it was bad for Reitz down on the crest line, if you were in this trench with the Lancaster Fusiliers and other regiments, it was absolutely ghastly. And though the British could fire at the defenders who were the attackers trying to come across the crest, they could do nothing against this enfilade artillery fire. And it was going to get worse and worse. And by about 1 p.m, the hottest part of the day, on a completely bare summit under fire from multiple directions, a crisis began to emerge. Boer forces had managed to edge around the right-hand side, the eastern flank of the British position, and were actually firing lengthways down the trench. That fire from a Boer rifleman was so galling and so brutal that the right flank began to recoil and collapse, and some Boers emerged from behind cover to actually enter part of the British trench. And it was at this point that a hero of the Empire intervened. This is Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Thornycroft, a man mountain, about 6 feet 5 inches high, tall. By estimates, he weighed somewhere in the region of 20 stones. He was absolutely a huge man, built like a tank. And he had become the commander on Spion Kop as a result of all the casualties that had been sustained. In fact, Buller had actually approved him being made commander, having learned that the existing officers had all been killed or wounded. And Thornycroft saw his right flank collapsing and ran across with this huge bulk, actually injuring his knee in the process, ran across the battlefield to the right flank and bellowed at the Boers who were coming, and actually had dragged a few British soldiers away as prisoner. "You may go to hell. I command on this line and I allow no surrender. You must leave," and apparently beat some of the Boers with the flat of his sword and just bundled them out of the position and drove them back. And they were a bit surprised. They did drag some British prisoners away with them, but they retreated back and the British line turned and made a sort of stand against it. Thornycroft injured his knee when he was doing this, and that would begin to debilitate him as the battle went on. Thornycroft also led several charges across Spion Kop to try and clear the Boers from the crest line, and he had some success with this, But what he found was the Boers would just retreat down the slope, and then the British on the crestline would be exposed to even more fire, would have to fall back to the trenches, and the Boers would return. Whilst there was carnage atop Spion Kop, what were Buller and Warren doing? Well, the short answer is not very much. Warren's command post was much closer to Spion Kop, but it might as well have been on the moon, because he had no ability to communicate with the summit. Heliographs, which signalled by light, by sun, had all been smashed on Spion Kop, so there could be no signals there. And Warren didn't think to send anybody atop Spion Kop until very, very late in the day, as we'll hear. Buller was much further away. He was well south of the Tugela River, and he was watching this through field glasses, and he contributed essentially absolutely nothing to this battle. And I think this is part of Buller wanted to see Warren faith. And unfortunately, this command arrangement would ultimately cost a very large number of British lives. Warren couldn't get information about what was happening on Spion Kop, and indeed his one intervention was to order the British artillery to cease fire. Warren had become confused, not getting information from the battlefield, and although the British were shelling Little Knoll and Twin Peaks quite effectively, Warren gave them orders to cease fire because he thought, given the number of shells that are exploding on Spion Kop, the British must be accidentally firing on Spion Kop. In fact, of course, it was Boer artillery that was pounding the position, and so his one main intervention was actually to reduce fire support for the British. And Buller's main intervention was to come later in the afternoon, because a brigade under Neville Littleton had gone across the Tugela River with the initial intention actually of providing some reinforcements to Spion Kop, and one of his battalions, one of his 4 battalions, would be detached and actually go to Spion Kop. But Littleton, who was a tough fighting man, a strange man, and in some ways quite a boring man, he was known for his love of cricket and nothing else, saw an opportunity. He perceived that the Boers were all concentrating their fire effectively westerly and were not in a position to resist an assault that he was about to launch. And acting on his own initiative, he moved his brigade up and began an assault on the Twin Peaks, with the idea of clearing off the Boer riflemen and crucially their pom-poms and artillery there, and relieving pressure on Spion Kop. And this is probably the most successful British attack of the day. It took several hours of pretty hard fighting from point to point. Littleton had the advantage. He was commanding a number of troops who were Northwest Frontier veterans who fought against the Afghans, who knew something about hill fighting and close skirmishing. And they fought their way up the hills and actually reached the summit of Twin Peaks and drove the Boers, not completely off, but quite far back. The Boers were shocked actually by the ferocity of the assault and were alarmed that their position was now going to start to collapse along here. The British were going to roll up this entire line. Littleton himself wrote, "A finer bit of skirmishing, a finer bit of climbing, and a finer bit of fighting I have never seen." He was a pretty grizzled veteran. Many agree with this account. But Buller saw it very differently. He saw this assault going up here, and he was not happy about it because he had not ordered it. In fact, he sent not 1, not 2, but 3 messages to Littleton ordering him to cease the assault and return back to the river line. The first 2 arrived and were actually picked up by the brigade officer Henry Wilson, who'd gone to be famous in the First World War and eventually become chief of the Imperial General Staff, who read them and by his own account folded them up and put them in his top pocket. But by the time the 3rd order arrived, Wilson felt he had no choice but to pass it on to Littleton, and Littleton felt he had no choice but to accept it. And so the very promising assault petered out really by about 4:35. Littleton fell back, and the Boers reoccupied their position and started firing on Spion Kop once more. In the midst of all this, Warren was fishing around looking for somebody to go up Spion Kop and find out what was happening. There were various young officers floating around his headquarters, and he had sent others up at various times, but some had actually failed to get to the top of Spion Kop, so brutal was the climb. But somewhere around about 4 p.m, Warren ordered a young Winston Churchill of the South African Light Horse to make the ascent and go to the top of Spion Kop and find out what was happening. Churchill was also given instructions to tell whoever was left atop Spion Kop that reinforcements were coming and that they should hold on a little longer. And Churchill, always a great penman, left a great account of what he found atop Spion Kop. He remembered, "Streams of wounded met us and obstructed the path. Men were staggering along alone or supported by comrades. or crawling on hands and knees, or carried on stretchers. Corpses lay here and there. Many of the wounds were of a horrible nature. The splinters and fragments of the shell had torn and mutilated in the most ghastly manner. There was, moreover, a small but steady leakage of unwounded men of all corps. Some of these cursed and swore. Others were utterly exhausted and fell on the hillside in stupor. Others again seemed drunk, although they had no liquor. Scores were sleeping heavily. Stray bullets struck all over the ground, while the Maxim shell guns scourged the flanks of the hill and the sheltering infantry at regular intervals of 1 minute. Churchill found a pretty bleak scene atop Spion Kop, and despite the intense fighting that was still going on there, he actually managed to make contact with Thornycroft. By this stage, Thornycroft was exhausted. His knee injury was causing him a lot of pain, and Thornycroft was horrified by the losses he'd suffered in the trench. He was literally surrounded by his own men. It's Thornycroft's own unit, a South African unit. He'd gone to the summit with somewhere in the region of about 160 men. By the end of the day, 80 of those men would be dead. So he'd lost half of his own unit, as well as hundreds of the rest of the force. And Thornycroft was totally exhausted by the time Churchill found him, around about 6 p.m. And Churchill remembered, I found Colonel Thornycroft at the top of the mountain. Everyone seemed to know, even in the confusion, where he was. He was sitting on the ground, surrounded by the remnants of the regiment he had raised, who had fought for him like lions and followed him like dogs. Churchill recognised immediately Thornycroft was stunned, perhaps in a state of shock, injured in the knee as well, injured from falling, dirty, dripping with sweat, bedraggled, and clearly not in a great state. Churchill urged Thornycroft to hold on, and by now, one thing to really stress is the battle was beginning to peter out. The Boers had been fighting all day. Their guns, in some cases, their barrels had overheated and needed time to cool. Some of the riflemen on the crest line had it, they'd gone back, they'd fallen back. The Boers had thrown everything they had at the British position, and the British position had held. It had held, and the Boers themselves were wondering, what more can we do to throw the British off this position? Tomorrow they're going to expand the assault, clear the rest of the ridgeline, and our position will collapse. But of course the British on Spion Kop didn't know that. All they knew was that they'd been in an absolutely grueling fight, and it wasn't clear how this battle could be continued or renewed. Churchill actually told Thornycroft that the Royal Artillery was prepared to bring naval guns onto the summit of Spion Kop and engage the Boers directly from this position. Now, we may actually ask ourselves what those guns would have done, enfiladed as they would have been, under heavy fire as they would have been, but nevertheless the British artillery was prepared to make that effort. And actually getting those guns up the slope would have been a monumental effort, but the gunners were prepared to try. The plea to Thornycroft to stay and actually hold the line and defend this position, though, would fall on deaf ears. Thornycroft was exhausted. His men had been shot to pieces all day. He had received some reinforcements, but none that had turned the tide. And he did not believe this shattered force could actually hold on long enough for the artillery to get into position. And Churchill remembered the decision had already been taken. Thornycroft had never received any messages from our generals, had not had time to write any. Messages had been sent to him. He had wanted to send others himself, but communications had been impossible. The fight had been too hot, too close, too interlaced for him to attend to anything but to support his company, clear those rocks, or line a trench. And Thornycroft had made the decision, despite Churchill's intervention, that retreat was the only option. Sometime around this time, somebody, a stray shot probably, although it might be nice to think about it as a named effort, a bullet whistled past Churchill, and you can just see the distinctive black ostrich feather of the South African horse here. A bullet flew past Churchill while he was consulting with Thornycroft and blew the feather clean out of his hat. A few centimetres the other way, and it would have been no more Winston Churchill. The decision was made, and at 7 p.m, the British began their retreat down the mountain. Now, the sun sets quickly in South Africa in the summer, as you may know. Dusk fell over the battlefield quickly, and the British retreated down in relatively good order, it must be said, as night fell, doing so as quietly as they could to not alert the Boers they were retreating. And what was interesting is the Boers were beginning to retreat at the same time. The fighters who had lined the edge of the crest were falling back into the camp. And again, there was actually a sense of despair and disillusionment. Some men mounted up and simply left. Others were stunned by the violence of the fighting. This had been a prolonged, brutal battle that had gone on for some 12 hours. The artillerymen reported back to Botha that in some cases they were very short of ammunition, they weren't sure they could renew the battle the next day, and asked for orders. But Botha, determined to hold this position, and perhaps having a soldier's instinct that if his men had suffered, so too must have the British, ordered there be no retreat from the surrounding positions, and that at first light, dawn the next day, he wanted scouts up on Spion Kop to assess what the British had there. Whereas the British retreated and would not return, Boer scouts would creep onto the summit of Spion Kop in the morning. Amongst them, Dennis Reitz, who'd survived the firefight. And as he went up the slope the next morning, he remembered there was no sound or movement atop Spion Kop at all. There was mist still lying across it. And he crept up there, began going up the slope in the rear of some scouts, and he remembered, as dawn broke, there was not the slightest sound or movement. But then, to our utter surprise, we saw two men on the top, triumphantly waving their hats and holding their rifles aloft. They were Boers, and their presence there was proof that, although almost unbelievably, defeat had turned to victory, the English were gone, and the hilltop was ours. And amongst the Boers who'd reoccupy the hilltop was an unknown cameraman, possibly a German cameraman, we're not sure, who'd take some of the most evocative photographs of the dead of this battle that will be widely and quite shockingly published. These are men of the Lancaster Fusiliers. And perhaps the most shocking photograph of all is this one of the trench. This is on the right flank of the trench. You can see how comparatively shallow it is. The breastworks on the right. But this trench was being taken lengthways throughout the battle with heavy cost. There were a number of dead already in the trench, and the Boers moved bodies that were lying on the hilltop to actually use this as a burial ground. The battle had been lost, and Reitz, who was atop this, was shocked by the violence that he saw. And he remembered in the shallow trenches where the British had fought, the soldiers lay dead in swathes, and in places the bodies lay 3 deep. Our guns in particular had wrought terrible havoc, and some of the bodies were shockingly mutilated. There cannot have been many battlefields where there was such accumulation of horrors within so small a compass. The trench here would ultimately become what is now effectively the cemetery atop Spion Kop, and so that's it on the battle, and that is it now, with those bodies buried with various memorials laid atop them. And the cost was brutal. The British had lost at least 243 dead, 1,250 wounded, and 150 missing or prisoners. In total, though, that's the minimum, that's the lowest possible casualty figure. Records are a little bit hazy on this, but modern academic research suggests that total casualties for the British was somewhere in the region of 2,200, making it the bloodiest battle in Imperial War, the Imperial Wars that Victoria fought. The lot of officers were very heavy as well. Colonel Woodgate was killed, Colonel Blomfield of the 2nd Lancasters was wounded and dragged away by the Boers, actually taken prisoner. And the Boers themselves, although compared to the British, who I believe had lost over 2,000 men in this battle, killed, wounded, missing, the Boers lost 68 dead and 267 wounded, which sounds mild compared to the British casualties, but we have to bear in mind the Boer army was much, much smaller than the British. And for the Boer experience, this was still a grueling, brutal, and terribly bloody battle. Spion Kop would never actually fall into British hands. The Boers would abandon it at the end of the Tugela River battles in the end of February, and the British would actually go atop the crest to find the Boers had buried bodies. This would then be turned into a graveyard, effectively a cemetery atop Spion Kop, which is now owned and maintained. Though the ground's owned by the South African government, the cemetery is maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And this is a photo taken about a year after the battle. That's the same trench. You can see it's being filled in. The first markers are already beginning to appear. And one other thing to note here is just what a barren plateau this is. Now there's actually some trees atop Spion Kop that have grown. These are post-battle trees. There were no trees there when the battle was actually fought. They've emerged since. But at the time, this was a completely bare hill. The ground very hard too, so that when bullets and shells struck it, they tended to ricochet. it has to have been one of the ghastliest places for any battle to have been fought. And the tragedy, I think, of Spion Kop is how close the British actually came to victory. Thornycroft had not been injured and exhausted, perhaps had made the decision to hold on, and the Boers would probably have been defeated. They'd have probably been forced to fall back. They needed time to reprovision their guns, bring more fighters up. They wouldn't have had that time, and they might have found themselves being rolled off the ridge lines piecemeal. But of course, the British didn't know how badly damaged the Boers were, and the tragedy is all this sacrifice, all this effort that was made atop Spion Kop would ultimately be in vain. As we wrap up, it's worth reflecting a little bit about what happens to some of the characters in this story. Louis Botha probably needs no introduction, as does Winston Churchill. Also here, as a stretcher bearer, was Mahatma Gandhi, who was on the battlefield. But of the British commanders, it's worth reflecting what happened. Warren was ruined by this battle. He would ultimately be sacked for it. He'd go on to write a peculiar little book under a pseudonym, which defended his conduct and criticised everybody but himself, and then he effectively becomes obscure in history and he disappears. Buller would remain in command, and he ultimately, possibly more by luck than judgment, eventually hammer his way through the Boer lines in February after a number of pretty bloody battles and further setbacks. Thornycroft would go on to fight through the entire Boer War and would become a minor celebrity actually in the context of the Boer War and indeed after. And one interesting experience, a few years ago I was giving this as an online presentation and I was introduced virtually to his great-grandson who still has all of his wartime equipment. And one of the interesting things Thornycroft had in his possession, which is now in his great-grandson's possession, is a handful of dirt kept in a container that he took from Spion Kop sometime after the battle. And one can't help but wonder whether perhaps Thornycroft carried the experience and indeed the sacrifice that was made here with him all his life, and that's still in the Thornycroft family now, along with his uniforms, medals and military equipment. But that, ladies and gentlemen, was the Battle of Spion Kop in just fractionally over an hour, and I understand we now have a little bit of time for some questions before dinner. So, if you've got anything you'd like to ask about this battle or the Boer War in general, I'd be more than happy to field it.
Was it just the lack of communication that stopped the British getting reinforcements up there?
Some reinforcements did go up there. There was some additional infantry. When Littleton made his attack, he detached a battalion that went onto the crest. The problem was, it took so long to get anybody onto the top. If you could get up faster in the day, it was slower at night. But it's going to take a unit, somewhere in the region of 2 to 3 hours to go from the base to the summit. That's a long time, and by the time you do it, you're tired. And crucially, that also means that information can't come up and down. So units went onto the crest or became adjacent to it, near to it, but then they just get locked in this brutal bombardment. They get trapped there, they can't withdraw. Messages coming back asking for support aren't helpful. And what's really what the British need is not more troops on the summit, they need attacks on the supporting hills. And the tragedy is Littleton does just that, and he's basically at the point he's about to win and gets recalled by Buller, who's miles away. So if there'd been more coordination, if this had been part of a wider series of attacks, I think it could have unhinged the Boer line, but it was never conceived as this, and the one that begins under a brigadier's initiative is then called off. So unfortunately, we ended with a tragedy.
So following on from that question, what else did Warren control that he could have used to ride in the frontage?
He actually had about a division's worth of troops. So a division in the Boer was a lot smaller than the First World War. So he's got somewhere in the region of about 5,000 to 6,000 troops, plus some light forces, plus some cavalry, plus he has control of an artillery field gun line. He can appeal to Buller's heavy artillery, which is south of the river. So he has somewhere in the region of, in terms of reserves he could deploy, about 2,500 men could probably go into action. And he keeps them all just north of the Tugela River in camp, doing absolutely nothing. And he does send some troops up the slope, but he does nothing with them. And Warren effectively, my reading of it is, he becomes paralysed, as sometimes happens in battle. He's confused about what's happening. He doesn't understand how violent the battle is atop Spion Kop. He's getting some messages down, but they're mixed. There's some messages that come down and give the impression it's a disaster up there, everything's lost, the colonels are dead, what do we do? And then there's other messages, well, you know, they're still up there. As I said, Warren thinks there's so many shells hitting Spion Kop that it must be friendly fire, which doesn't really augur well for his control of the battle. But he does nothing. He doesn't attempt to widen the battle. His one idea fixe is, we'll take Spion Kop, hold it in the day, get guns on it, and then unlock it. It's not part of a more complex plan. And he does nothing. He basically hangs around at the bottom of Spion Kop, futilely sending messages and not getting messages back. And it's not a great command performance.
So Lady Smith gets relieved, doesn't it?
It
Despite all
does.
this?
Yes.
So how does that happen? What do they do?
That's another story entirely. So this is Spion Kop gets abandoned. Warren gets sacked. Buller brings his army back towards the Colenso line, and then there's a series of battles that are known as the Battle of the Tegela Heights, which is a series of battles where Buller is trying to take key hills and trying to unhinge the Boer line there. He loses a battle at Val Krantz in early February, but then he swings east of Colenso. I didn't show you a map there, but there's a series of hills there that overlook the Boer position. And in really a multi-day battle, Buller's forces slowly battle their way onto the hilltops until they've broken the Boer line here. And the British attacks there are way more sophisticated. In fact, they're almost First World War-esque. The largest coordinated bombardment the British Army makes prior to the First World War occurs in the Battle of Tegela Heights. It's very well coordinated. The Boers just get pinned down, 76 British guns firing on the Boer position, more or less simultaneously. And especially we call it a sort of creeping barrage, with the guns just pounding the Boers until the British are right on top of them. And the Boers are exhausted too. Every battle they win, they suffer casualties, and they can't replace these casualties. Attrition has ground them down. Buller's methods undoubtedly improved. The army's got better as well. It's learned a lot more about how to fight in this terrain. And the position's completely unlocked by the 28th of February, and Lady Smith is finally relieved. So it's a pretty bloody campaign, though. Even the Battle of the Tegela Heights, it costs thousands of casualties. It's brutal stuff.
I have to declare an interest because I did my MA on this under Spencer's supervision. As I say, we'd like to comment a bit more. One of the things that struck me when I was looking at this was how bad communication was. And you touched on the fact they probably didn't like each other, but they were still trotting around on horses. There were no wires, nothing like that, low down where they could get. It was like Waterloo.
Yes,
Horses
yes.
going around. How much do you think that played a part? As much as Buller could see what was going on, but did nothing. Warren was down the bottom of the hill, couldn't see up enough. And he finally sent up a few jugs of water, you know, all drying up. It was appalling badly managed. And do you think that was Buller teaching a lesson?
I personally, there's always that saying, something can be explicable even if it's not excusable. And if we apply that to Buller, either he's blithering, either he's so incompetent he's almost comical, or I think he's almost in a feud with Warren, and he's just decided, okay, Warren, you put us here, you get us out here. And his refusal to communicate with Warren, as you said, the communications between the two are absolutely appalling. You know,
And the force left already, didn't it?
yes, it did. And Buller just refuses to do anything, just sits there and basically with his arms folded and says, well, you sort this out, Charles. And Warren, as you say, has got no real insight into how the battle's being fought, whereas Buller has. Buller can see the Boer forces on the Twin Peaks and so on. And Buller's contribution is non-existent. He doesn't even pass on the information, you know, you're being severely hit from the flank, you should do something about that. So if we're looking for an explanation, the only explanation I can see for Buller to be so obtuse about all this, so difficult about this, is he's so angry with Warren, he just thinks, well, you sort it out. And that is disgraceful conduct, to be perfectly frank.
Would you like to touch on their correspondence with this group? I think?
Gosh. Well, the two, I hinted that the two men disliked each other, but I think it's a bit more than that. I think there was a genuine loathing there. These two men hated each other for various reasons, and their correspondence is, it's not just unprofessional, it's actively hostile, it's rude correspondence. In an army that, if nothing else, the Victorian Army knows how to talk to one another in writing, and these two men are sour, it doesn't where it even begin. And of course Buller goes on, and he's still very popular with his own troops, Buller. He's sort of well liked by his own troops. he'll later fall foul of political machinations in many ways, and a slightly ill-judged speech he gives after the war. That's another story entirely, but it reflects extremely poorly, I think, on both men. I would love to have been a fly in the tent at their first meeting, because that seems to be the starting point for all the troubles that follow. And we have one or two witnesses to that who say they immediately disliked each other, but even so, there's a war to be won, gentlemen. You know, to quote Dr. Strangelove, you can't fight in here, it's a war room. These two men must find a way to get on, and sadly they don't. And that is where we can. It's sometimes fun to read their vicious correspondence. Ultimately, this costs 2,000 casualties. These men die because these two generals cannot function together.
Tell us a little bit more, having been there and seen the terrain, the odd weather conditions, about the weather and the mists at the top. I think that's quite influential in the events that you described in the last 45 minutes.
It is. So this whole area, it's and around Ladysmith. Ladysmith's almost encircled by hills, and Ladysmith, mining town, pretty tough town now. I'm not sure I'd recommend a visit in 2024. The weather conditions here are really quite distinctive, and in the summer what you get is you get blazing hot days that sometimes give way to afternoon very intense thunderstorms that go into the evening. But one thing is, at dawn it's always misty, and we're not talking a little bit of wispy mist, we're talking a pea soup. You will not see more than basically your arm's length away, and it blankets everything. And it's quite eerie, I found, because you can go out into it, and the only thing you could ever hear was frogs, because all the frogs are calling in the summer. There's a lot of croaking and things, but it is absolutely eerie. And I actually find Spion Kop a very eerie battlefield, because you're very high up. It's very bleak. There's trees, some trees there now, and there's some facilities there. But if you're there first thing in the morning, you can't see a thing, especially in the summer. You really won't. I can't emphasise enough. If you go up there early in the morning, I can understand why British soldiers didn't realise there's actually a crest here, because you can't see anything. And they may well have stumbled across these German gun pits and thought, oh, well, this must be it. We'll sort of defend it here. But it is really eerie. And even I think when the mist is clear, I find the top of Spion Kop quite haunting.
Yeah.
Very, very quiet, because you're obviously high up. There's no road, well, there is roads, but there's not very little traffic. Very quiet, a little bit of wind blowing across. And the other thing that strikes me is it's hot. It's 1,400 feet above sea level. There's no cover. It's a bit like you're walking on the surface of the sun in the middle of the South African summer, and it just hammers down on you. It's pretty grueling in there. I can understand why Thornycroft was totally exhausted by the end of this battle, carrying around somewhere between 18 and 20 stone in the middle of a battle. And that's, he's a muscular man. He's not an overweight man in that sense, but it must have been absolutely brutal.
Sounds in a way as though they just attacked the wrong hill.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
And so I have two questions about it. One is, did they have the capability of the people to do a better reconnaissance before they launched this thing? And secondly, did they have artillery that had the capability to fire counter battery on the Boer artillery to break this up?
So two good questions. The first one about reconnaissance is, bluntly, they didn't. Warren, and indeed the British Army at this stage, did not have good reconnaissance assets. The best reconnaissance asset Warren had was Dundonald's cavalry, which was really a mixed South African force. That's pretty good at sort of roaming out and things, but one thing it can't do is just go up the hills. You're going to have to get off your horse and do this. And what it means is, as far as I can tell, and I've looked at a lot of this battle, is the decision to assault Spion Kop is made without anybody going up any of the hills. Warren's been probing around these hills for some days. He knows Tabenyama to the north is heavily defended. And so he's looking at it, and one thing I will say, and I hope my photographs carried some of this, is from ground level, it really does look like Spion Kop dominates all the other hills. It really does. It's only when you get on it you think, crikey, you actually were exposed to multiple directions. The British didn't have their artillery in the right place. Their artillery was on the south of the battlefield. Now it could shoot at the Twin Peaks and Little Knoll. There are Boer fighters there. What it couldn't do was put counter battery fire from that position onto Tabenyama, which is where the main Boer batteries are, and they're just hammering down. the British would have had to deploy their artillery differently, and they hadn't done that. And one of the reasons they didn't do that was I don't think Warren realised the guns on Tabernyama, which had been facing towards the British, could just be turned and still see onto Spion Kop. So a serious mistake. And as I mentioned, when the British artillery does open up actually on Twin Peaks and starts to really keep the Boer heads down, Buller thinks, oh, it's a friendly fire incident, you're shelling us, and he tells them to stop firing when they're actually doing some really good work. So you've got a perfect storm: poor reconnaissance, misleading information, the artillery's not in the right place, and when it does start firing effectively, Warren orders it to stop. So it's a disaster. Yes?
I'm astonished to hear you say that Winston Churchill was actually involved in the Battle of Spion Kop. Because Winston Churchill was actually a newspaper reporter in South Africa. And when he was taken prisoner, which is the famous story, he actually catched a lift on the railway train, not as a soldier, but as a reporter.
That's right.
So how could he possibly be delegated to go and report on the affairs at the top of Spion Kop? Indeed, I haven't read it anywhere, but that is the case.
I can tell you actually, he had a conversation with Buller, who gave the temporary command. He went to see Buller, who gave the temporary command.
That's right. So he, after he'd escaped from prison, he made it back to Durban, he expressed his interest in rejoining the British Army. And the army said, you can, but you're not allowed to be a reporter at the same time. And that's not going to work for Winston Churchill. He needs the money, if nothing else. So he went to see Buller and said, what can I do? And Buller said, well, you can have a temporary commission in the South African Light Horse, which is effectively an irregular unit. And so it came that he was but he wasn't really with the unit. He was this roving man around headquarters, and that's why he ends up at Warren's headquarters, a young 25-year-old reporter, but in uniform, fishing around for something to do. What exactly happens between Warren and Churchill isn't completely clear. What we know of Churchill, I suspect he's probably in Warren's ear saying, I'll go up and look into this, or Warren may have sent him up, but at some point, Churchill goes up with Warren. Warren's given him some information to take to the summit, so he goes up, but of course, he's a soldier journalist at this stage. Officially he has a commission from Buller. Really, he's a sort of odd man who's floating around and causing a certain degree of havoc, it has to be said, but that's why he's a top Spion Kop in the uniform.
Also, he was apparently almost arrested by Warren when he came down, because he was so rude to Warren.
Yes.
By what had happened. Warren got really upset.
Yes, Churchill is not very impressed, and Warren, who's by this stage you can see his army pouring down, he knows the battle's lost, he's dismayed. There's a pretty frank exchange of views, and Churchill is pretty blunt about what he's encountered. And in Churchill's account, which I've read part of out, he's pretty negative he's very positive about Thornycroft, but he's pretty negative about Warren. By insinuation, he doesn't come out all guns blazing for him, but it's not even between the lines really. It's very, very it's very clearly there.
Yes, you referred to Buller, muscle turned to fat. What was the sort of general fitness level of the British force then at Spion Kop? And were they all regular troops, or were there any militia battalions?
So at this stage, the British forces here were mainly regular. The second line troops were coming out to South Africa, but there weren't any actually in this force. What was here was a number of irregular units, like the South African Light Horse that Churchill was in theory an officer of. You also got some Royal Naval Gun detachments that had come out as well. But at this stage, you've still got pretty much all regs. In terms of their fitness, we have to remember that the British Army of 1899 was a relatively small army. Your minimum height requirement was 5'3". And although these were regulars, and particularly some of the troops were Northwest Frontier veterans, these were tough regs in their mid-20s, many of them who'd served on the Northwest Frontier, pretty fit and tough. But others had come straight from Britain. And although they've been in the field now for several months, they've become tanned and a bit battle-hard, and they've become acclimatised. Because one thing that will surprise you in this part of South Africa is if you're exerting yourself physically, you get out of breath pretty quick. You're going up and down these slopes in the heat. Blimey. So they're pretty fit and hardy at this stage. But one thing to really emphasise is they are a mixed force. Even on Spion Kop, you have a mixture of regulars and Thornycroft's, really these locally raised cavalry. So these are British South African settlers. So they're pretty fit and hardy men as well. So fitness-wise, they're pretty good. But even if you're fit, and I speak from experience, going up Spion Kop on the approach is pretty grueling even now.
Equipment. You mentioned right at the start they're using those rifles, whether they're the latest German rifles or ones that are historically 10 years old. You said that they had British pom-pom artillery. Where are they getting their artillery? Where are they getting their rifles? Was it a proxy war with Germany supplying equipment down to the borders? And how does that compare to the British using, presumably, the latest Lee Enfields? In other words, were they a fairly good match? Because if you've got the latest Car 98s against Lee Enfields, they're well matched and they'd fight pretty well.
It's a good question, and the answer is really, it wasn't going on so much once the war had begun. But in the 5 years from the Jameson raid, which was this botched attempt to overthrow the government with mercenaries, to the outbreak of the war, 4 years spell, the Boer government, which was wealthy because of its gold and diamonds, had invested very heavily in importing weapons. So they had purchased the latest German Mauser rifles and ammunition to go with it. They had purchased British pom-pom guns, they purchased French Creusot guns, and also the famous 155mm long toms, these huge heavy artillery pieces, and the required ammunition to go with them. When the war broke out, the Boers don't have a port. They have to import things through Portuguese East Africa. And actually in the early part of the war, really up until around about April, May 1900, the Boers could import things through Portuguese East Africa, which was much to the frustration of the British. And of course they did. And in terms of equipment match, rifle-wise, the long Lee Enfield of this era is about a match for the Mauser. What's different is the way it's used. So the British at this stage, apart from a handful of units and some irregular units, they're using volley fire. So you will have your company or your half company stop, shoulder, prepare, aim, fire. The Boers don't. They are individual marksmen who fight as a sort of swarm of bees. You might recall that quote about them coming up the slope like an aggregate of lion hunters from cover to cover. And it means that the Boers in the early stages of the war, and then again in the guerrilla stages, tend to get more out of their equipment because it suits them better. You can use this disparate group of almost skirmishers and you're firing away, whereas a line of men volleying back, you can see when they're about to volley and you just throw yourself flat. And so actually hitting things in the early part of the war is pretty poor. One thing that's also noticeable is the Boers, gun for gun, are probably better equipped than the Royal Artillery. The Royal Artillery has 15-pounders and it has 12-pounders, and it has a handful of naval guns as well that start to arrive. There's some who are actually at this battle. But the naval guns, the 4.7 inches, are improvised. They're naval guns on quickly made carriages that have to be pulled by oxen because they're so heavy, whereas the Boer French guns, the 75mm, which is not their famous 75mm incident, it's not the famous quickfire. The French won't sell that because they're worried the British will capture one, which is quite interesting. But the French guns are probably more sophisticated than the British, and the Boer 155s, the long toms, are more powerful than anything the British have at the start of the war. So the advantage the British have is the Boers don't have that much artillery. They're a relatively small army when the British can outgun it eventually.
One very brief question, which is, Lord Thornycroft, who served in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, is he a direct descendant?
Gosh, I don't actually know. I'd have to check that.
The second one is, the end of the conventional war happens in 1900.
Yes.
So there must have been quite a turnaround. Is it just due to the fact that the British had so many that they overwhelmed them? Or is it, as you sort of indicated, that actually the tactics get a lot better and somebody somewhere is doing a better job?
It's a bit of both. So the British have lots more troops in theatre by early 1900, launch multiple offensives. There's a very important document that gets issued by Lord Roberts in January 1900, which is called Notes for South African Warfare, or Notes for South African Fighting, I think. And in some ways, this is a really fascinating document. It's a short document, quickly printed, keep it in your pocket, read it, and it is the distilled wisdom of several months of really hard fighting against the Boers. But this is how you fight the Boers. Your standard training isn't going to work. We're going to have to change things. And you can draw, it's a wavy line, but it's a line. You can draw a line from that document that's issued in 1900 right up to British Field Service Regulations of 1909, which take the British Army through World War I and then later through World War II. And one of the key things is, listen, you're going to have to start showing some initiative. you're going to have to start making decisions, communications are going to break down, and once the attack's pressed, even if it's better to do something and get it wrong than not do anything and have a cock up. So that's issue. Buller's methods improve, the army gets much better. The Tegela Heights battle is far more sophisticated than this battle. The Boers get worn down, they can't sustain heavy losses, and unfortunately they start sustaining them. So it's a mixture. The British have got more troops, better handle, they inflict casualties on the Boers start to get exhausted, and the conventional war ends. You can split hairs on exactly when, but the last pitched battle is August 1900, and then by then the Boer capitals are in British hands. But then after that pitched battle, Battle of Berganda, the Boers make a decision and say, we can't fight the British head on, we're going to subdivide our army into individual commandos, and we're going to start a guerrilla war, and then a new phase of the war starts. But that's perhaps a talk for another time. So, because it's 8 o'clock now, I believe dinner's about to be served. So thank you very much.